So I'll just introduce you.
Okay, really quickly.
Yes.
None of this professor, this, that, and the other. It's
So-
Advaita Prabhu does.
Today's speaker is our Honorable God Brother, Sri Advaita Prabhu. And he is renowned professor. He's writer of many books. One of the most famous books, probably I think is the most famous, is the commentary on the Yoga Sutra. Is that the most famous?
मैं क्या बता सकता हूँ भैया.
So, if anybody wants to read Yoga Sutras, I recommend his book. I always recommend his book. It's the best, very thorough on each sutra. Traditional commentators, modern, everybody included there. And from Vaishnava point of view, that is the beauty. He's also written other books, book on Kṛṣṇa, he's written book on stories from Bhagavatam. He's translated 10th canto of Bhagavatam. And he's now working on a book to prove that God has a form. And God has form. And I think that is the subject he's going to speak today. So, to him.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Does everybody speak English? Yeah?
Few of them.
Few of them. Who does not speak English?
You can speak in Sanskrit.
Om Jnana-timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshuru Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Namo Viṣṇu Padaya Kṛṣṇa Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swamini Namine. Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Darine. Akhanda Mandala Karam Yena Vyaptum Characharam Tat Padam Darshitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hey Krishna, Karuna Sindhu, Dinabandhu, Jagatpate, Gopesha, Gopika Kanta, Radha Kanta, Namostate. Tapta Kanchana Gaurange, Radhe, Vrindavaneshwari. Been telling everybody that comes here, Vrindavaneshwari. Radharani is the Iśvari of Vrindavan, Vrindavaneshwari. Vrishabhanu Sute Devi, Pranamami Hari Priye. Apavitra, Pavitro Va. Sarvavastha Gado Piva. Ya Smaret Pundarikaksham. Sa Bhayabhyantara Shuchihi. Okay, well, Babaji asked me to say something about the book that I'm writing, which is a bit awkward because we, as devotees, we don't really want to talk about ourselves. But the book might be of interest, and the request of my dear godbrother, I agreed. So it's going to be different from what you normally do here. You're normally reading Shastra. So this is going to be more of an intellectual history project. It's an academic project. So I will say a little bit about it, and we'll see if we have any interest or not. And if we do, we can have some questions. But the project was born because in the West, people don't take the form of Bhagavan seriously. It's considered to be mythological. So no academic, no educated, or and anyone coming out of a Western academic intellectual background is not going to actually believe that the forms of course we're interested in Kṛṣṇa, but any of the forms of the Hindu deities are actually real. You'd be laughed at if you went to an academic conference and you gave a paper and you suggested, even for a second, that there was any reality to these forms. They're considered to be mythological. And of course, what does mythology mean? It means, okay, something that may have some cultural value, may have some moral teachings associated with it that is of interest, but nothing to be taken as historically or literally true. And a corollary of that attitude and really Hinduism is, if you think, what is Hinduism, right? There's so many different aspects and branches and communities and so forth, geographical and jati-based, caste-based. Hinduism is a variegated cluster of so many different things. But if there's a common denominator, pretty much it is some form of bhakti towards some form of Iśvara and Iśvari, right? That's Puranic Hinduism. Hinduism essentially comes from the Puranas. There's a few Gyanis here and there in Rishikesh and in Sitalchaya. We have some serious Svadhyaya, but for the most part, Hinduism is some form of bhakti. And bhakti, of course, is the relationship between a bhakta and a form of Bhagavan or Bhagavati. So these forms are considered to be, so therefore Hinduism, right, the religion of over 1 billion people, is considered to be based in mythology, right? Not rational. It's irrational, right? Something that it's not based in reason. It's based in outdated beliefs that the West has discarded with the rise of Christianity, right? The Greco-Roman traditions have been left, maybe they've flavored a little bit aspects of Christianity, but for the most part, these cognate traditions, right, Indo-European traditions, were left behind 2,000 years ago. So therefore, Hinduism is not respected, actually. Maybe some few things, like, you're right? Your face was like, maybe a few, actually the only thing that's really respected in Western academia is Buddhism. It's Buddhist philosophy. Even though Buddhists have their bodhisattvas and they have their Buddha realms and they have some pretty far out stuff going on, but somehow or other Buddhism has a veneer of intellectual respectability where Hinduism does not, in academic contexts. So this, of course, has bothered people like me who've been in academia for decades. So I decided to investigate why is it that these forms, because bhakti essentially requires a Bhagavan. That's what bhakti is. We just said bhakti is a verbal noun. It's a verb which has a subject and an object. The subject is the bhakta does bhakti, and the object is Bhagavan or Bhagavati. So that's what bhakti is. It requires, inherent in the word bhakti, as a verbal noun, inherent is the need for an object, and the object is Bhagavan, Bhagavati. And what is Bhagavan, Bhagavati? What's Bhagavan? It's an entity that possesses qualities like color and form and shape. So these are the great forms of Bhagavan that are worshipped, and Bhagavati, that are worshipped all over the subcontinent. So my project then, I thought I was done with academia. I thought, all right, I've done 40 years. Now it's time for just go back to Bhagavat Svadhyaya. But somehow or other, just as I was on the tail end of my academic life, I got this just urge. Hopefully it doesn't come from my ahankara. Hopefully it comes from Bhagavan. But I got this urge to investigate. Why is it that in India, everybody quite naturally, even the great philosophers, even the great Nayayikas, the great Vedantins, they had no problem accepting that Bhagavan has a form? Why is it that what is it about Western intellectual history that completely and utterly, when they run into this aspect of Hinduism, it's like a brick wall? Okay? Westerners, for the most part, we're generalizing. You're not supposed to generalize, right? That's rule number one. You go to university, first day in university, you sit down, boys and girls, lesson number one, don't generalize. So you're not supposed to generalize. It's called essentializing. No essentializing, bad thing. But if we were to essentialize or generalize, we could say, even in yoga circles in the West, right? People doing yogasana, including, Iyengar and various communities, have a problem with the forms. They might stick a Patanjali in a corner somewhere. They might have a picture on the wall, but nobody's serious. Very few people, right? Except for weirdos over there, like Mary. Very few people are seriously accept the reality of these forms. So, and these are people that have opened their hearts to Indian culture in the form of yoga, in the form of so many different things, mantra meditation, kirtan. So it seemed like there must be some kind of reason. Is it just a cultural divide? Well, what does that mean, a cultural divide? What does that mean? Right? We're all embodied beings. We're Atmans in bodies. We have minds. We have chittas. What does that mean, a cultural divide? And where does it divide? Is it like Turkey, like Istanbul on the left? Okay, that's the west. Well, what does that mean? So it seemed to be a worthy project to try and get some sense of where does this samskara, this dvesha, okay, this dvesha towards the form of Bhagavan, where does that come from? So that was you know what the side effect of that is, the corollary of that? If you reject form-based bhakti, if you reject form-based Hinduism, then the corollary of that is the only acceptable Hinduism is monism, Advaita, or some form of neo-Advaita. Usually not Pakka, usually not classical Shankara Advaita. That's a little too extreme, right? Typically, people are not willing to go like the world is totally unreal. That's a little bit too big of a step. But some form of monism then becomes the acceptable face of Hinduism, both in popular yoga culture as well as in academic discourse. So therefore, some form of Advaita is intellectually respectable. But any form of real bhakti is considered to be not taken seriously. So therefore, it seemed to me this needed some kind of analytical attention. What happened? Why is this the case? So that was the trigger. Actually, the real trigger was I was sitting in on a class in a philosophy of religion, and it was a class in comparative mysticism. And there was, comparative mysticism, they were really trying hard to find some kind of core. Is there some core to mystical experience? And the intention was benevolent. The intention was to try to prove that mystical experience is genuine. And the way that they set out to do this was to try to identify a common core. If you can identify a common core, then you can say that all the stories and the surface level stuff is cultural and is secondary and is not important, if you can identify this common core. And of course, that you run into a problem right there, because in order to establish this common core, you have to really force the traditions into saying what they're not really saying. Because the traditions are all saying different things, right? Kashmir, the moksha of Kashmir Shaivism is very different from Pratitya Samutpada of Nagarjuna. It's very different from the moksha of Advaita Vedanta. It's very different from. So in order to, anyway, so in this class, we were reading this, this scholar who was doing his best. The intention was to try to resist materialism. Materialism is going to say that the differences in all of these religions, the reason they're different, is because they're the products of material culture. There's no real core. And they're different because people make them up. They're constructs, right? So therefore, the Jews are going to make up a story, and the Christian, and the fact that there are these differences, that in itself is proof that there is no common core, that there's no spiritual foundation. Because if there was a spiritual foundation, they could be kind of saying the same thing with maybe some cultural flavoring on the top. Yes? So far, so good. So these comparative the comparative mysticism is trying to resist that, this turn towards materialism, by saying no, there is actually a common core. But what happens to make that common core? You have to throw things out that don't fit that common core. You have to jettison things that don't fit your idea of what the common core is. And what gets jettisoned? Forms of God. Any talk of forms gets jettisoned. And what really triggered our irritation, I have two co-authors, is there was a statement, just a random statement without any backing, and it was talking about visions of the Virgin Mary. And the scholar said, oh, there are a few visions in this sort of in mystical experience, but we don't need to take these visions seriously. They're just rustic, uneducated people. Anyone having a vision of a form reflects a kind of uneducated, non-intellectual background. That was the trigger that really myself and my two co-authors, we were sitting in that room. We said, that's it. We got to do something about this. We got to challenge this whole premise that form is some kind of a primitive, not sophisticated form of religiosity and spiritual experience. So, before you can mount a defense of divine form, and you can, we'll get to that, it seemed to us we needed to excavate, where does the dvesha, where does the resistance, right? Dvesha means animosity. It's the opposite of raga, dvesha. You know raga anuga. So dvesha, where does the dvesha to form come from in Western intellectual contexts? So the story, you have to go back to the Old Testament. If you read the Old Testament, God is what they call in study of religion, is very anthropomorphic. Anthropomorphic means as a morphe, as a form of a person. So if you read the Old Testament, God talks, he walks around the Garden of Eden, he has hands, in Ezekiel, he has its vision, occasionally the prophets see him, Moses sees the back of him. There are clear, throughout the Old Testament, there is no question that God has a form. There's no question. And scholars do not deny that at all. That is totally and utterly accepted. That in the Old Testament, Yahweh, God, Bhagavan, Yahweh in the Old Testament, has a form. So what happened? How do you go from a revelation, a scripture, where God clearly has a form, no way around it? Well, there was a way around it, but we'll get to that in a minute. How do you go from early Jews, early various Jewish communities, and early Christians, first 200-300 years of Christianity, everybody accepted God had a form. How do you go from that to a complete and utter rejection of divine form, when your own scripture is very clearly you have a Yahweh, you have a God with form? So that was the beginning of the journey. So we pulled out all of the quotes from the Old Testament, and then we had to look at the various rabbinic traditions, the various Judaic traditions, right? What are they doing with these statements? And for the most part, many Jews, even to this day, there are Jewish communities that accept that God has a form, even to this day. So there were various communities that accepted this, and so we did, so all of that information is there. And then you have the emergence of Christianity, right? Christianity is accepting the Old Testament, right? The Christ is the Son of God. We're talking about God the Father. So Christ is God made flesh. So the New Testament doesn't deny accepts the Old Testament and makes it does not reject at all the depiction of God in the Old Testament with form. So essentially what happens is around the 3rd century, you have Christianity emerging in the Near East, which is all Greek speaking, and the intellectual elite of the Near East are all basically schooled to be educated, to be an intellectual, and for centuries, but certainly in the 2nd, 3rd centuries, to be an intellectual meant you were schooled in the Greek classics. So you were schooled in Plato, you were schooled in Aristotle, and in the other great Greek thinkers. And Christianity was considered to be a religion for rustic people, simpletons, not educated, not intellectually sophisticated. So it was not taken very seriously by the Greek-speaking intellectual population. Christianity was emerging on the margins amongst. If you've read the New Testament, right? Christ is speaking to the poor and the downtrodden and basically social outcasts and misfits. I don't think any of the 11 apostles were. I can't remember now. It's been a long time. But were there any intellectuals? Were there any sort of from the intellectual class? I think not. But anyway, for the most part. So around the 2nd, 3rd century, you have the emergence of what is called the early church fathers. And they are the basically intellectuals whose dharma it is. They're theologians. What is the dharma of a theologian? A theologian has a dharma. The theologian of a dharma is to defend the integrity of a tradition. That's the dharma. You have to defend the tradition philosophically. That's in the Indian tradition. You have the purva pakshas, right? You have all the purva pakshas. So when you read a bhasha, you're not just reading the siddhanta, right? The beginning, before you get to any siddhanta, you're engaging the purva pakshas. That's the dharma of the theologians. You have to establish your tradition vis-a-vis the intellectual milieu of that tradition. So depending on your time and place, so for the Nyaya school, it's Buddhism. For Vedanta, it's Mimamsa is the Purva Paksha, and Sankhya is the Purva Paksha, not Buddhism. People say Shankara defeated Buddhists. There's no proof of that at all. There's very little reference in Shankara Bhashya to Buddhism. There's maybe a couple of verses in the 2nd chapter. The primary Purva Paksha for Shankara is Mimamsa, in terms of the tradition, and Sankhya in terms of the cause, right? Tattva Brahma Jignasa, Vedanta, Sankhya, Prakriti. So the dharma of the theologian is to defend the siddhanta of a school in dialogue with that moment in time. So who's our Purva Paksha now? Purva Paksha now are physicists and materialistic and those who are seeking consciousness in whatever, neurological correlates or brain patterns. That's our Purva Paksha of our day and age. So the early Christians then, they also had a dharma to give. They were not taken seriously, right? There's no philosophy in the New Testament. Christ was not a philosopher. So their duty was to give intellectual respectability to early Christianity. How do you do that? Where are you going to get your philosophy from? Well, the Greeks. So what basically Origen, Tertullian, the founding fathers of Christianity, grafted Greek philosophy onto the Bible. So you now have you know what a graft is? It's like when you get a branch of one tree and maybe another tree has a better root system, a stronger root system, and you have some fancy tree that is not so strong, like a peach tree or a fig tree, so you get a branch and you put it, and maybe the apple tree has a strong root system, so you graft your fig tree in, you split this, and you graft it in, so now you have a mixture of an apple tree root with whatever it is, that's a graft. So essentially what happens and we'll focus on Christianity, but the same thing happens in Judaism. Although the Jews held on a lot longer to the idea of God with form, actually, and that still exists in some communities. So what does that mean? Grafting the Greek philosophy then is where you get a rejection, because the Greek philosophers are rejecting their own gods. They're a little bit embarrassed about the Greek epics, like Homer. The gods are very immoral. And they're always having a bit like Indra, actually. You ask Babaji, how does Indra get his... next time you're falling asleep in class, ask Babaji, how does Indra get his 1,000 eyes? He'll tell you a story. So the Indo-European gods are like that. So the Greek intellectuals are embarrassed about their own gods. But they can't reject it. It's culture. Homer, right? So essentially, it's from Plato and Aristotle especially that the idea of a god with form becomes totally rejected. And the main point is, what's being rejected is the idea that all form can only be a material substance. Form means materiality. That's never challenged. No one ever questions that. For something to have form, right? Because what are the Greeks are philosophers. What is philosophy? You're making inferences. What do you make an inference from? Sense perception. How do you make an inference? You're studying Nyaya, right? So you make your anumana, and you say, wherever there is smoke, there is fire. It's based on perception, isn't it? Why did Charvakan say you don't need three pramanas? There's only one. Everything is perception. Actually, you see the smoke, and because you've seen 1,000 million smokes in the past, and there's always vyapti. Wherever there's smoke, every single time there's fire. So then you say, well, okay, there's never been any known. It's all based on empiricism. It's based on the perception of the relationship, the vyapti. I can say this, right, because you're all studying Nyaya. There is an infallible relationship called vyapti, but it's based on perception. So philosophy, science, and logic are based on sense perception. So therefore, all known forms are made of matter. Right? Wherever there is smoke, there is always fire. You've never seen smoke other than as a linga of the fire. So therefore, Aristotle and Plato and the Greek philosophers say, well, we've never seen form other than material form. So therefore, if you want to say God has a form, you have to say he has a material form. That's the vyapti. Yes, vyapti, form, matter. So therefore, if you, Christians, but they were doing it initially, they did it to their own gods. If you want to say these gods have a form, well, then their forms are material. Now, what's wrong with that? Because all material things are compounds. They're compounds. Things come together. If something is a compound, then what? You can break it apart. And if you can break it apart, then what? Well, it's not eternal, is it? Any compound is a product of elements brought together. So any material thing that you can perceive, even Nyaya would say that. If you can perceive it, it's got to be at least a triad, right? There has to be three dyads. So anything that's perceived, any form is material, and any material thing has various problems, which are not suitable for the God that you Christians believe in. Because any material thing is first of all, it's reducible to smaller entities. Number one, problem, yes? Do we want to say Bhagavan is reducible? Are we all doing okay? Yeah. Can you pull Bhagavan's arms off? No, but you can if he's made of matter. So, number two, what else? What other problems do you have with materiality? Spatiality, limitation. Isn't your God supposed to be infinite and all-pervading? Well, all material forms are limited and spatially located. So you have all kinds of problems that accrue from the idea of a God with form. Remember, all forms are material. That is never questioned. Why would it be questioned? No one's ever perceived a non-material form. No one's ever... You're going to say smoke comes from fire, and somebody says, well, there's a spiritual fire that, it breaks the rule. Well, prove it then. Show it. Until you can do that, the vyapti holds good. Anybody can come and say anything. So therefore, these kinds of presumptions, which are sound, they're sound. Anything material is limited. So it is sound. Human intelligence cannot do it much better than that. Human intelligence can only make inferences based on sense perception. Inference is parasitic on empiricism. An inference is based on sense perception. Do you see that? Is that clear? Yes? Is it clear?
It's clear, it's clear. Carry on.
Thank you. Right, so so when we say that early Christianity is influenced by Greek philosophy, this is what we're talking about. So this idea that the idea that the early Christian, that the Bible has a God with form, gets totally decimated by Greek philosophical assumptions. Okay, so now you're a early church father. You're Dharma, right? Well, everyone's laughing at your religion, right? You're a bishop. And when you're going to the church, and your Christians are saying, well, Father, they're laughing at us. They say we're simpletons. We don't have any intellectual backbone. You have to do something about that. If you're a theologian, right, Babaji, if somebody comes in and starts making jokes about you people believing in what kind of a God is this? He steals butter, right? What kind of a ridiculous religion is this? You God crawling about in the sand, right? You're just going to shut up and say Om, right? Or do you have to have some kind of a response? Well, if you're a acharya, you have to have a response. That's what it means to be an acharya, and that's what it means to be a founding father of the Christian church in the 3rd century. So, well, what are you going to do? So now you want to show that Christians can be intellectually sophisticated, and the way to do that is to borrow Greek philosophy and graft it. We know what grafting means, right? You graft it onto the Bible. What are you going to do with all the references to God having a form? You can't throw them out. It's Shastra. Bible is a canonical text. You can't start cutting bits out. If you start doing that, then forget it. Then you're not a Christian. Well, what does it mean to be a Christian? You believe in right? What does it mean to be a Jew? You believe in the Old Testament. What does it mean to be a Buddhist? You believe in the teachings of the Buddha. You believe in a canon. There's a canon. Shastra. Shruti, or more like Smriti. So what do you do with all the references to God? Well, a Jewish theologian who was struggling with the same problem in the Jewish community, called Philo, probably was not the very first, but he was the first to popularize the allegorical method. So allegorical method means you can say you can't change the Bible. If you don't like the Bible, go away, become a Buddhist, go off to India. Do something else. But if you want to be a faithful Christian or a faithful Jew, you can't change your scripture. So then what do you do? Well, Philo gives this method where you don't have to read things literally. You can read them allegorically. So when the text says, oh, God was walking around the Garden of Eden, the allegorical method would say, well, it doesn't really mean he has feet and he walks. It just means that he's everywhere and he's present and he's aware of everything. When the text says God spoke, it doesn't really mean he spoke. It means that he knows everything and he can communicate through the hearts of... And you come up with alternate, non-literal ways of reading, okay, these statements that are awkward for you. Any statement you don't like, awkward. And Vedanta is the same thing. Vedanta is the same thing. You can use secondary reading if the first reading doesn't work, right? The village if it doesn't work, right? The village can't be in the Ganga, so it must be on the banks of the Ganga. So the Indian tradition has the same opportunity that you can apply a secondary reading if the first reading doesn't work. In the Jewish context, the Christian context, then the entire anatomy of God as a form, was subject to this allegorizing method. For 100 years or so, there was tension with this. Not everybody wanted to accept this. There was a lot of resistance. There were Christians that were attached to this idea that God had a form. So it took 100 years, but by the 4th, 5th century, nobody, there was no intellectual was talking about a God with form anymore. So at this point, Christianity and mostly Judaism, although Judaism, some of the anthropomorphic traditions lingered on. We'll get to India. Hang in there. If this is very important. Is it not of interest to you how your religion is presented in the West? Why do people actually, nowadays people don't come out and say like they would in the colonial period. They don't come out and say, oh, this Hinduism, yeah. You can't do that anymore because we are living in a politically more sensitive time. But people, intellectuals, do not respect, certainly not the devotional traditions. They might respect the sentiment, they might respect, but they don't, for a minute, think that any of these deities are real or true. Shouldn't that be something that interests you? Shouldn't that be something that if you have any kind of a theological disposition, you might want to push back on? I ask you the question. So this is relevant, my friends. It's not just chitta-vritti. Well, it is, but it's useful chitta-vritti. Okay, so now we have 4th century. The anthropomorphic God of the Old Testament is expunged. Is replaced by any references to anthropomorphism. Right, that means the form of a person, anthro, and morphe in Greek means a form. Anthro means like anthropology. So then by the time you get to the great Christian theologians, Aquinas, Augustine, so the book is covering all of this. It'll be good ammunition for you, my friends, when it comes out, while you're reading your Udayana and your Vachaspati Mishra. You take a little moment and look at some of the stuff. It will be useful for you if you're interested in communicating with people of other cultures. If you may not be interested. It's perfectly okay. You might just say, okay, I'm going to stay here to study Shastra. That's fine. But if you have any interest in engaging our intellectual world, then this is one of the issues that you're going to have to deal with. The fact that in Hinduism, these forms are accepted as real. So there's 2 things you can do. You can defend the notion of a God with form, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the other thing you can do is show why it is that the Western intellectual traditions originally also accepted a God with form, but what happened? What were the cultural influences that caused that belief to be jettisoned and rejected? Right. So that's where we're going with this. But let's get to India. Okay. So now by the time you get to the 15th century, for 1,000 years, whether in the field of Christian theology or in philosophy, no one is seriously taking, when they talk of God, no one is talking about a God with form. 1,000 years, that's a very long period of time for anti-form samskaras to be embedded in Western intellectuals, in intellectual context. So, now you got your first missionaries. You got your Portuguese. And they jump on their boats and they come to, no European has been to India since Alexander. You got a gap of almost 2,000 years. No one's going because Islam has emerged. Islam is controlling the trade routes. Westerners are not going to India. So only when they've discovered the navigational developments that they were able to bypass the Islamic trade bloc and go around the Horn of Africa and 16th century and establish the first Portuguese contacts. So then the first thing the first reaction is that you see these deities, and I don't know what would be very interesting to see who were they looking at. Were Viṣṇu forms, and it's very interesting to see how they're looking at references in the Old Testament. Especially, for example, when Moses comes down the mountain with the 10 Commandments, and the Jews have gone back to worshipping idols. And the idols, some of them are pretty gruesome. There was a god Baal. There were various idols. they sacrificed human babies, and they had a golden bull. He'd put the baby inside the bull, and you would light a fire under the bull, and as the child is screaming, the scream comes out of the mouth of the bull, and it sounds like a bull. And that was a human sacrifice. There were pretty demoniac forms of idol worship. When they get to India, so there's samskaras of what an idol is. This is a huge thing in the Old Testament. Thou shalt not worship the graven image. Thou shalt not worship false gods before me. This is massively, right, 10 commandments given by God. This is, whether you believe, or even if you don't, nonetheless, it is part of your cultural inheritance. These samskaras are massively engraved in the minds of all Westerners. So they get to India, and it's very interesting. And you even have diagrams. This shows you how when you have strong samskaras, you don't even see reality properly. And they were drawing the deities. God knows what they were seeing. But they were drawing the deities. Could have been Viṣṇu. What else could it have been? South India would have been Śiva, would have been Viṣṇu, not so much Devi, but okay. Right? Well, what would be the deities that you see? When they draw them, they're drawing deities with horns, with hooves, with chicken heads, with God knows what, right? Which are monsters, because monster is something that, a monster is a creature that has limbs that shouldn't fit together. That's the definition of a monster. And they're seeing the deities as monsters. And they're drawing them. We have the pictures. We have the drawings. So this is the first reaction. The first reaction is to think this is Satan. These Indians are all going to hell. They're very pious, nice people, but Satan has come in the form of the idols, and he's misleading all of these souls. And so that's the first impression. And the missionaries go, actually, when they hear these reports. These are the first travelers and the first merchants. So the missionaries go, actually, the missionaries were misguided, but if, when you read the missionaries' accounts, they're actually really sincere people. They really believe that the Indians are going to hell forever and ever 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 and not karma, and ever and ever and ever. And they really deeply believe that they have to save these poor souls by preaching against the forms of God. Okay? They was utterly misguided theologically, but incredibly sincere. They were engaging in enormous tapas. Don't conflate missionaries with the colonial power. They were two different. The colonial people didn't like the missionaries. Missionaries were critiquing the colonial people, the colonial power. In fact, missionizing was even forbidden at certain points of the colonial period. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much of your time. So then you have okay, so this develops an event, and so then there's preaching, Okay, now, so then all of this is coming from this inherited background of really Greek philosophy grafted onto the Old Testament, this complete inability to theologically, there was not even conversations. There's very hard to find any record of conversations about the forms of God. You find conversations about caste, right? They were very interested in caste. There were critiques of caste. The conversations between missionaries and pundits. It's very hard there must be some out there, but it's hard to find any serious conversation about the forms of God. The Western, whether they were missionaries or colonial, a priori, this was not a topic that had any intellectual merit whatsoever. It was not even worth a conversation. And so the pundits didn't talk to them about deities. Right, talk to them about, Gita, Dharma, they like that, okay, fine. Yoga, okay, they get that, fine. Talk to them about yoga. Talk to them about, Dharma, okay, they like Dharma, etc. So, okay, so this is the situation. And if we had time, we could look at Indian philosophy and you know, the idea of God with form. Okay, we had a look at the Western side of it. What about the Indian side of it? Actually, Indian intellectuals rejected the notion of a God with form on the same principle. Mimamsa and Nyaya, two of the schools, actually come up with arguments that God cannot have a form. But the arguments are different from the Aristotle and Plato arguments. The arguments from Nyaya and Mimamsa, the same arguments, are, well, if God had a form before creation, then how could he have a form before creation? There hasn't been creation. A form is something that's been created, it's been brought together. Again, the same presupposition that all forms are material. That same presupposition that all forms are necessarily made of matter that Aristotle had and Plato had, and that gets absorbed, that's never questioned. For 1,500 years of Christianity, that same presupposition, you see it, bang, right there. Buddhists, all the anti-form traditions of India, that God can't have a form, but the arguments are a little bit different. And the main argument on the Indian side, which is Nyaya, who are theists, they accept Iśvara, is that all form is matter. Why do you say that? Because all perceived form is matter, right? All perceived smoke comes from fire, so you make an inference. So therefore all perceived form is matter. Therefore, if you want to postulate that God has a form, then since all form is matter, then you're postulating that God has a material form. And if you're going to postulate that God has a material form, then you run into all kinds of problems, such as reducibility, such as spatial limitation, and so forth. Okay, so then you get to the Vaishnavism, and in that particular chapter, obviously in the Vaishnava tradition, you encounter the notion that Krishna's form is Shuddha Sattva, it is Gunatit, is beyond the gunas, and it is Brahman. And what is Brahman? What is Brahman? Brahman Taittiriya Upanishad, Satyam Jnanam Anantam. It is consciousness. It's Sat, right? It exists, right? So it's not reducible. It is Jnanam, which is another term for Chit. Satyam Jnanam, and it's Anantam, not Ananda. That comes later. Later on, you get this idea of Satchidananda. You don't get that. I don't think Shankara uses Satchidananda at some point, and it doesn't matter. So you get this idea that what is Brahman? It is consciousness. Okay, it's Chit, and Prakriti is Achit. It's Sat, Prakriti is Asat, and it's Ananda, and Prakriti is Dukalayam. So you have this binary, you have it, so therefore it's not material. If it's not material, what is it then? Right? So in other words, this presupposition of Aristotle, of Plato, of Nyaya, of Mimamsa, of all of the anti-form theologians and philosophers immediately is undermined by the Bhagavatam saying, well, actually, his form isn't material. It is Satchidananda. So right away, you're opening the door to a whole different kind of conversation. So then what does that mean? A form made of Sat-Chit? Well, the only experience we have of Chit is subjective experience, right? Well, what is Chit? Chit for us is a subjective experience of qualia. Qualia means thoughts, sensations, sense objects. We know what consciousness is, right? Because we're conscious. As a matter of fact, that's one of the arguments that Shankara introduces for the proof of the Atman. We know we have an Atman because everybody knows you have it. You don't even need philosophy. You know you're conscious, so right there is your proof. So how do you think of a form made of consciousness? It's impossible for us to wrap our rational minds, right? Rational mind means a mind made of samskaras. Yes, samskaras. What are samskaras? They're imprints of sense objects. Sense objects come in through the senses. They leave their imprints. Samskaras, right? Now we want to engage in abstract thinking, theological thinking, philosophical thinking. We can only use the samskaras. There's no magic. So any kind of concept we come up with can only be made of samskaras. What's it going to be made of? Right? So therefore, it is impossible for our chittas to think of what a form made of chitta, what does that mean? But so therefore, this is beyond human comprehension. But Jiva makes one interesting comment, and he says that it's gana cetana, that somehow or other it's condensed consciousness. What does that mean? Condensed consciousness. But it's a little something. It's a little something. I think of it as, steam. When it condenses, it becomes water. When it condenses, it becomes ice. So we do have some way of analogizing, right? Because something we can't understand, you have to find some material analogy. Otherwise, you can't even think about it. So if it's beyond human comprehension, you have to find something that maybe helps a little bit. So for me, the idea of steam, which is H2O, and then water is H2O, and ice is H2O, so it's the same product, but it can go from a sort of subtle state to a thicker state to a denser state. So that's how I think of gana cetana, of condensed consciousness. So now we get to another question is, well, why didn't they mount a philosophical defense? Why didn't they oppose Nyaya? Why didn't they say, you're saying God cannot have a form because forms are material products? Why didn't they just say, well, actually, we challenge that? They do engage Nyaya. They engage Nyaya because Nyaya wants to say that Iśvara is only the efficient cause, not the material cause. So they engage Nyaya's theism. Why didn't they engage this central point of Vaishnavism? Bhagavan's Rupa is central. You'd think they would want to defend that philosophically. What is bhakti? It's Krishna's form. The devotees fall in love with Krishna's form, whether it's little Gopal, whatever the form is, whether it's Krishna and we fall in love with the form. Why didn't the Vaishnavas mount? And they were rigorous and vigorous intellectuals. Why didn't they mount a philosophical defense, or even just challenge the idea that all forms are material? They don't do that. So we have to come up with an answer to that, and the answer we came up with is given right away in the beginning of Vedanta Sutra, where it's very clearly stated that that you cannot understand Bhagavan through reason. You can go so far. You can understand that creation is a product, right? Nyaya, creation is a product. Anything that's produced has to have a producer who knows the material ingredients. He has to know the material ingredients, and he has to be able to put them together. So therefore, since all products, right, another inference, right, wherever there's smoke, fire, wherever there's products, there's a producer. Okay, so the world is a product, so you must have a producer, and not just that, the producer has to know everything about the ingredients. So since we're talking about the whole universe, then Iśvara must know every single ingredient in the universe. Well, then that's another way of saying sarvagna, he's omniscient. And he must have the ability to put it together, so we'll call that omnipotent. So you can go that far with reason. With reason, Anumana, right, Ikshater, Vedanta Sutra, you can say that Brahman, Janmadhyasya Yataha, from which the universe emerges, Sutra number 5, Ikshater, it is intelligent. And you can go a bit further and say not only intelligence, but that intelligence has to know everything about Janma Adi, right? So therefore it must be omniscient. So you can go that far. And then Ramanuja and Shankara are very clear. You don't even know if it's one Iśvara. Your intelligence cannot rule out the possibility. You can say that the creation has to have an Iśvara who is intelligent, but you don't know it's one Iśvara. What if someone says, well, there's two? How do you answer that? Intelligence cannot respond to that. You can just say, well, by Occam's razor, by Lagutva, it's easier to think of one than two, but that's not a strong argument. You could say, how do you know there's not 2 or 10? And how do you know creation took place at one time and not over extended periods of time? So therefore, intelligence can only establish that there must be an Iśvara. The Iśvara is omniscient and omnipotent, can go no further than that. And the Vedantins are very clear. Anything else you need the Shastra. So that's the only explanation I can find as to why they don't bother arguing against anti-form theory, because their position is it's no point arguing because human reason can only go that far. So therefore, it can only be revealed. And therefore the Bhagavatam is what we accept as a form of revelation. And in the Bhagavatam, then Krishna's form is non-material. So that immediately a priori, it undermines all the presumption of all anti-form arguments, whether it's Plato or Aristotle or Nyaya or Mimamsa, all are based on the fact that form can only be material. Bhagavatam instantly, well actually it's not material. So therefore, so you have that. And then you know what's very interesting in the Bhagavatam is the stories that seem to be simple stories. They actually contain within them, I'm thinking that they must be aware of the Purva Pakshas. Why did they pick those stories? There must have been so many stories of Kṛṣṇa. But some of those stories, inherent in the stories, is a response to the Purva Paksha without actually stating it. For example, the fact that form is a limitation. It's spatially limited. Well, what about when Kṛṣṇa manifested Kṛṣṇa for every single gopi? What about when Kṛṣṇa manifests into each and every gopa and every cow, and then manifests Viṣṇu forms? What about these stories show that actually form is not a limitation? What about Kṛṣṇa manifesting 16,000 forms in Dwarka? So therefore form is not a limitation if you can manifest an infinity of forms. So the story itself, without being philosophical, actually contains a immediate response to the limitation Purva Paksha. What about Kṛṣṇa opening his mouth and the whole universe is within him? So form isn't a limitation there if the whole, right, God's supposed to pervade everything. So now you have everything within the form. So in this way, the Bhagavatam has tools to respond innocently, without formal philosophizing. It has tools to respond to the most common anti-form Purva Pakshas. One more thing and then I'll let you go because you're all yawning. And that is, there is actually one argument, a theo-philosophical argument that can be put together. And you can tell me what you think. There was and this, we kind of finished the book with this. There was a great theologian in Christianity called Anselm. And Anselm came up with this definition of God. God is that being than whom nothing greater can be conceived. Okay, he's the being than whom nothing more perfect and greater can be conceived. If you can think of something greater, then that original one wasn't God. So therefore God is the being whose niratishaya, whose perfection is unsurpassed. Okay, stay with this, I'm almost done. Okay, so therefore God is the most perfect being. Now the Christians didn't go down that. So therefore he's omni, he has to have omnipotency, he has to be omniscient, right? Because he has to be the being who has the greatest of all these qualities. The Bhagavatam doesn't stress omniscience and omnipotency. What do you think Yogamaya is all about? Yogamaya is all about suppressing that. You don't want omniscience and omnipotency in Vraj-lila. Get rid of it. Cover it up. What's the quality that's actually stressed? Beauty. Think of Anselm. God is that being than whom nothing more perfect can be conceived. Now I ask you a question. What is more perfect? A beautiful being or a non-beautiful being?
Beautiful.
A beautiful being. What's the word for beauty in Sanskrit? One of the words. What's another word? Another one. Rupa. Rupa can be a word for beauty. What's the word for form? Rupa. What is beauty? Beauty has to be instantiated in a form, right? Just like smell has to be is situated in earth, And taste is inherently situated, you can't separate it. If something has taste, it's instantiated in water. If there's something is visible, it has the fire element in it. It's inseparable. So if something is beautiful, beauty can only manifest in form. Do you see the argument? So if we want our Christian friends two things we have to do. First of all, show why they're averse to form in the first place, when clearly God has form in the Old Testament. Well, what happened to you guys? You're worshipping Aristotle and Plato more than you're worshipping the prophets of Israel. You're more than the revelation of the Bible. You have allowed, you are not reading your Bible literally. You've allowed Greek philosophy to hijack your relationship with the Bible. You are more followers when it comes to the matter of God's nature. You are followers of Aristotle. Do you know what Aristotle's God is? You've heard of the prime mover? He doesn't even know the world exists. He said there's a God. There has to be something, right? Movement. You have to explain movement, right? There's movement, right? I look up in the sky. Planets moving. Okay, why are they moving? Well, there's a force. Okay, scientists, proto-science. Well, okay, force. What's the force? Okay, this force, that force. Eventually, you've got to come to some causal force. And for Aristotle, that was God. But God can't be aware of. So it's like a magnet. The magnet's not aware that it's causing movement. Why? What's wrong with it being aware? Because what happens if you're aware of something? This is a big Buddhist argument against a God with form. If you're aware of something, then what? Look, this is movement, right? I'm God. What's happening to my awareness? It's moving. And if my awareness is moving, then it's not eternal. If something is moving, it's changing. If it's changing, this is a big Sankhya thing. If it's changing, then it can't be eternal. What's change? Something is here, and now it's over here. It's changed. Milk changes to yogurt. It's not milk anymore. So anything that has change, okay, there's ways around this, okay, substance and quality. So Aristotle didn't want his God to move at all because he had to be eternal, because the Greeks thought the universe is eternal. So therefore God is causing the movement. So he's not even aware of the universe. Good luck offering puja to him. Don't waste your money. He doesn't even know. He doesn't even know you went and bought some agarbatti. Save your money. So that's what you end up with reason, my friends. That's what you end up with. If you want to figure out God only with reason, you're either going to end up with Aristotle's God, who's just sitting there, self-absorbed, or you're going to end up with, certainly you won't end up with a beautiful God. So therefore, to wrap it all up, it's one thing showing where does the Dvaita form come from. That's a fine project. That's intellectual history. Show where does it come from. Okay, it comes from the Bible, anthropomorphic, Aristotle, Plato, graft them on. What's the product? Formless God. That comes to India. That conditions the way Westerners see Indian forms to this day. To this day, we're all inheritors, even if we're not religious. We inherit that samskara, right? So what are they then, if they're not real? Oh, myth. They're mythological. And if you want to be polite, you'll say, well, nice myth. They transmit cultural values, and that's the best you're going to get. Okay, so that's one thing. But if we're looking for a positive argument as to why God must have form, it's one thing saying, this is where your aversion comes from. It's another saying, well, God could have a form because, well, the Bhagavatam says so. Okay, but it's a much stronger argument to say, if you believe in God, God must have a form because God must be perfect in all ways. It's hard to, I don't think you'll find any monotheist that would question that. I don't think you'd find many monotheists would say, yeah, God's kind of imperfect. For the most part, monotheists want their God to be perfect. whether they're Muslim or Christian or Jewish. So then the argument then for form, defensive form, positive argument, is if God is perfect, remember this, it must be beautiful. And beauty requires form. And what is the Bhagavatam? No omniscience, no omnipotence. Yogamaya covers that up. What is the stress? Massively, massively, in the 10th book, Krishna's beauty. So therefore, we're hoping this work will provide devotees some philosophical background, some intellectual history, but especially some way of presenting Kṛṣṇa in a rational theological manner. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can wake up now. Does anybody have any questions?
Well, about the argument of form, I mean, if you give the argument that God does not have form because form is material and material is limited, temporary, but if you accept God as creator, then creator has to have a form. Because there is no example of somebody creating something without form.
Well, that would be, well, the Nyaya would say that he can do that with will and intelligence.
No, you can say it, but give me example, make the Panchaveva.
Okay.
It doesn't work. And
Fine.
especially the Western people who are
Yeah.
saying that, who are attacking Hinduism, that
Yeah.
God cannot have form.
Then we have no example.
So you give us how your God can be a creator.
Yeah. Yes. And that's what the Mimamsa would say. When they're saying God, both Nyaya and Mimamsa are saying God cannot have a body, their motive is different. When Mimamsa is saying God can't have a body, because bodies are limited, they want to deny the very existence of God, saying exactly what you said. In order to create, all known instances of creation require a form. So if there were a creator, and if God were a creator, he would have to have a form. And then they go on to show the problems with form. So they're actually saying exactly what you just said.
That's why they say there is no creation.
That's why they say there's no creation. Also because they don't want the Vedas to be secondary, not even to Iśvara. So, So, okay, that's an argument.
But I recently heard a very nice explanation
Yeah.
from Shankaracharya that why they rejected God.
Why they rejected God.
Yeah, I mean the form of God.
Why the Advaita does.
No, Purvimamsakas.
Oh,
He says that wherever there is form of God and worship, people tend to become lazy and they depend on God for blessings and they don't do their duties.
they don't what?
They don't do their yagyas and duties and all that, because Purvimamsa is, for them, dharma means yagya.
Yeah,
And now here you have an option
yeah.
that what you can get from yagya,
You can get from this puja.
I can get just from the puja.
They don't like that.
So they don't like that.
So they say that actually the gods are just the dative case ending.
That's why they say that God is
Dative
just the
case.
mantra.
Yes, yeah.
They don't have form.
Well, yeah. Because then no one does yagya and then no one is giving dakshin in the hundi.
Yeah, and that is second point, and that brings corruption.
But that's Kumarila. I mean, that's basically, I think that's Kumarila that says that.
Yeah.
I don't know if all Mimamsa, Kumarila is obviously the big
Kumara is the
spokesperson.
boss of Purvimamsa,
Yeah.
at least after 7th century. He's the one who revived it.
But even if you went along with that, then you could, the Purva Paksha could just say, well, okay, you need a form to create because all perceived creation is form, but that doesn't get you to a beautiful form. It's just a form. It could be an amoeba.
First we establish that he
A
has a
form,
form.
yeah.
And then if he has a form, why would he not have
Then we go
form.
on to beauty, yeah.
I mean, if he creates so much beauty here,
Yeah,
he must be beautiful himself.
yeah. So that would
How
be...
can a formless God create form?
Yeah, a Satkaryavad argument, yeah. So there's all of this. It just needs to be put together. The Vaishnavas didn't do it.
You see, the thing is that Vaishnavas or all the Vedantis, they did not want to argue because their two reasons for that. Number one is that by argument you cannot establish anything permanently.
Because a more powerful intellect can defeat your position.
Yes.
Shankara
And
says that right in 112.
This is said by Bhartrihari in Vakyapadyam, which is the last sloka of first chapter of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Yatne napi apadito artho yuktatareir anneir. That even if you have established, another person will come with a bigger intelligence and refute. So that's why tarko apratishthānāt. So that's the reason they tell to these Naiyayikas. They don't give much value to this establishing Iśvara and all that. He says, what is this? You accept Shastra,
Yeah.
Second thing is that Naiyayikas are establishing Iśvara. Their focus is in establishing Iśvara and not so much that he does not have a form.
Mm-hmm.
All of them, including Udayanacharya, they were all worshippers.
Mm-hmm.
There's a famous story of Udayanacharya. He went to Jagannath Puri. You might have heard that, then when he went, the temple was closed. So he stood there and he recited this sloka. Asvarya madmattosmi kapatam vidhaya vartate agate tu bodhe tu madadhina tavstiti. He says, now you are proudly sitting inside, not opening the door for me to have darshan. When Buddhist people will attack you, I have to protect you. So that means he protected him. So same Vishwanath, Panchanan, all these Naiyayikas from Navdeep, they were all worshippers. If you see their Mangalacharan, there is nobody who is doing Mangalacharan to formless Iśvara. All of them do Mangalacharan with the form of God. And then they talk that he has no form.
Mm.
So it was only primarily, as I think I told you, that to give these arguments against Buddhism, to establish Iśvara. I don't think they had any problem with Vaishnavas or anyone else. So that's why we do not engage in this.
And we have a different Purva-paksha. So in the case of the Christians, they're fellow monotheists, plus they have Shastra, where God does have a form. So part of what we're trying to do is to say, look, if you didn't just absorb this Greek philosophy and just read your own revelation literally, the Bhagavata can give you a lens of reading those anthropomorphic statements without accepting them as being, without feeling you have to accept them as being references to a material anatomy. The Bhagavatam is giving you another opportunity, another possibility, which is that maybe they're non-material. And if they're non-material, they're immune from all of the criticisms of the Greeks. And therefore, and part of what we want to do is say, look, your own texts, your own Shastras have a God with form. Here's a new here's a new way of looking at it. That's it.
Maybe one day Christianity will come back to their original state.
Inshallah, well, hopefully. Do we have any other questions, my friends? Yes. Yes.
In the Old Testament, I'm loud enough. I'm loud. In the Old Testament, what was the form that God had?
Well, it's not. Here's a huge difference. In the Indian tradition, you have 400,000 verses of the Puranas. You have 100,000 Mahabharata, you got the Ramayana, and all the derivatives. You have a massive amount of literature describing the forms of various forms of it. To try to allegorize all of that, when nowhere does it say you should read this, when it wants you to read something as an allegory, it tells you. Like in the Bhagavatam, you have the story of the merchants lost in the forest. It says this is an allegory. So it would be almost impossible, just the massive amount of descriptions of God's form, it simply would be impossible to apply the allegorical method to it, quantitatively. In the Bible, you only have a few references here and there. You don't have, the closest you have, the most dramatic vision you have is in Ezekiel, where you have this throne. And you have, all it says is, thereupon sat someone that was liketh to a man, looked like a man, humanoid, human-like, that it mentions loins, and he's sitting on a throne, and then the wheels are different creatures. There is a lion on one wheel, and there is an ox on the other, and there's some creature. And it's, it's all luminous and brilliant, and the throne is emerald. So that's the most vivid description and it's God. And Prophet Ezekiel, and clearly God. That's the most vivid description you have of God's form. Otherwise, you have voice here and there. You have, God in the Garden of Eden, but it's not described. But clearly he talks, he walks. So therefore you have anthropomorphic statements, but not you don't have any real visuals. So that's a massive difference. So it's easy to say, look, these few references here and there, we don't have to read them literally. We can apply an allegorical method, because quantitatively, they're very sparse. You can't do that to Bhagavad Purana, where the whole 10th book is nothing other than Krishna's form. And then if you look at the entire great corpus of Hinduism, how are you going to apply the allegorical? You might as well throw the whole thing out then. You can't apply the allegorical method and say all of these instances where Shiva's form is described and Devi and Durga, it's all to be read allegorically. And nowhere does it say that, right? If that were the case, 400,000 verses somewhere, they would say, by the way, don't read it literally, read it allegorically. I mean, that would be... So therefore, you couldn't apply the allegoric method and have a Hinduism. Whereas you can apply the allegoric method to the Old Testament because there's so few references, and you could still have a Judaism, well, clearly you do, and you still have a Christianity. So that's a very important difference. So essentially, God's revealing of himself, I mean, I don't want to make sectarian hierarchical statements, but if we accept these texts, and there's no grounds to accept one and not the other, if you accept these texts as revelation, let's for argument's sake accept them as revelations, divine revelations, God clearly has barely revealed himself in the Old Testament in terms of his actual anatomy, whereas the entire Hinduism is nothing other than a description of the various forms of Iśvara and Iśvari. That's a huge difference. So, yeah.
Well, besides that, there's also the personal experiences of so many great sages and acharyas down to this day. I mean, you read, like Vallabhacharya himself writes, when he was 11 years old, Kṛṣṇa appeared to him and he told him that he should give...
Do you know where that reference is, by the way?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
I'm going to write to you about that.
Yeah.
There's that as well.
And then, our own Goswamis and everybody, so many people had experience.
Did any Goswamis have a vision?
Well, there are stories.
But would any of the Goswamis themselves, right? I mean, the CC we have, obviously Sri Chaitanya, so, he went into...
Like Jiva Goswami writes in the Sandarbhas that even now some people see this.
Okay, but in terms of vivid descriptions, right?
Nobody wants to give that. He even forbids that.
Right, but if you're writing an academic book, and if you want to bring in mystical experience as a category of pramana, as an alokika pratyaksha, you have to provide it. You have to provide the story.
But what I'm saying is that generally, it is forbidden to speak your own experience. And Jiva Goswami specifically writes about this. The last part of Bhakti Sandarbha.
Sure.
He writes this, that don't reveal your experiences. Except to your guru.
That's fine. But we do actually have accounts.
We at least have heard stories about them. And he does make mention that some people still see that Vrindavan.
Okay. So that's...
Vallabhacharya certainly writes it.
That's what I mean. So there are actual claims. Yes. And even in the modern period, you have even the great Shivananda claimed to have seen Kṛṣṇa. You have Aurobindo in jail.
Also this Yogananda Paramahamsa.
Yogananda Paramahamsa. You have Muktananda. And so we actually are writing a chapter on mystical experience as a pramana. So we actually have to collect, document, claimed accounts. So there are some.
So that's why this allegorical thing will not work in India.
Pardon?
this allegorical explanation will not be acceptable here.
No, because you have no grounds to challenge pratyaksha without circularity. If you say you need another pramana to authorize a pratyaksha, you need to bring in another pramana, right? How do you know pratyaksha is valid? You have to bring in another pramana. Well, then how do you know that pramana is valid? You have to bring in, you end up in a vicious circle. So therefore you have to accept the pramanas as what do they call it? Self-illuminating, like the lamp. That's a discussion. Svata pramana. So therefore mystical experience is a svata pramana. And there are no grounds to question it that are not circular. So it's a bona fide pramana.
Jiva Goswami even calls it in Sarvsamvadini as Vidvat Pratyaksha.
Right. So all of this, so that's another additional,
He actually says that Shabda is nothing but Pratyaksha of sages.
I mean, the Bhagavatam is written because Vyas has the darshana or samadhi, and then he wrote the Bhagavatam. So it was triggered by his darshana. So in that sense, everything is back to everything is ultimately based in pratyaksha. Even the Shastra is based on pratyaksha pramana. Alokika, but it's still pratyaksha pramana. So so that's a whole other form of pramana, evidence for form, which is what you're saying. Yeah. But then if we want to use that as evidence for form, then we have to collect stories. We can't say, well, it's forbidden, we can't say this is a pramana, but we're not allowed to write about it, because then obviously that's not going to work. If it's a pramana, then we have to actually,
Mirabai has written songs like that.
All of that, yeah. Any other questions, my friends? Yes, sir.
Check if somebody's raising hand there.
But they're all asleep, Babaji. They were like just look, they're drinking their herbal tea.
I also wanted to know if there has been no Islamic influence in the formation of a formless God in Christianity, because we see that especially after Saladin took over Israel, there's been constant interaction, and the mathematics that they borrow is from Khwarizmi. So is there no influence from Islam?
You've got exactly the same story in Islam. You have a Quran with an anthropomorphic God. See, the Christians have to accept the Old Testament, the Jewish text, right? We're not talking about God, Jesus Christ. We're talking about God the Father. So the Christians are parasitic on the Jewish tradition. The Muslims accept that, but they're not really interested in it. They have their own revelation. Same thing, anthropomorphic God. So then you have basically you have what they call the traditionalists who accept it. You have anthropomorphic Islam for 2-3 centuries. Then you have what they call the rationalists who borrow the allegorical method. They borrow it from Philo, they borrow it from the Christians. They're borrowing the allegorical method. Then you have a very interesting third category. There was Ibn Hanbal, who says, we have no right to apply this allegorical method. Who the hell are we to not accept God's given us revelation, and we're going to say, no, it's not really what it means, and we're going to apply some secondary meaning? So on the one hand, he rejects the allegorical method. On the other hand, the traditionalists are taking the anthropomorphic references as God having a material form, same assumption, same problems. He realizes that's problematic, so he takes a very interesting position. It's called bila kaifa. We have to accept it literally, but we don't understand what it means. But we have no grounds to change it. If the Quran talks about God anthropomorphically, bila kaifa, we have to accept it without interpreting it, without speculating, without imposing our rational allegorical categories. It's very interesting. So it's an acceptance without applying, yes. And before we finish, there's a very interesting hadith. The hadith are secondary literatures, right? So the Quran is, you cannot question, right? Quran, Gabriel speaks in Muhammad's ear, in fact. But then you have all these stories about what the Prophet said, right, from his companions, and they're all collected across the centuries, and they're called hadith. And it's like the Shruti and the Smriti a bit. The Hadith are accepted as long as they don't, there's ways of checking their authenticity, what are the lineages, where do they come from, and they cannot contradict the Quran. There is a very interesting cluster of Hadith accepted by Ibn Hanbal, who was one of the most powerful theologians. I don't know what its status is today, this Hadith. Prophet Muhammad, and there's various lines of recension, gets up in the morning and he comes to the faithful, the assembly, Mangalarti, comes to Mangalarti, and he says to everybody, I'm sorry I was late. My Lord appeared to me last night as a young man wearing a green tunic, most beautiful. And he appeared to me as a beautiful young man. And a few little bits, green tunic, I can't remember exactly. And there's no reason to reject that, because the lines of transmission are even more bona fide than other things that were rejected. Eventually, it only gets rejected because of that content. In other words, whatever the criteria are for establishing a bona fide hadith, were all in place and acceptable, but at some point, the rationalists just cannot accept this possibility. But it's very interesting.
But then also not all Muslims have this idea of Quran being perfect literature, because we read in Khomeini that he talks about Tarif, that the Tarif, where Uthman al-Affan took out some verses from the Quran and burnt it during the Third Caliphate.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I didn't hear the question clearly.
Not all Muslims still consider the Quran to be a completely...
Is that so?
Yeah, because especially the commentaries of Khomeini on lot of hadith, he talks about the concept of tarif, where some verses have been taken out by Uthman al-Affan.
Taken out or inserted in?
No, taken out.
Okay.
By Uthman al-Affan, and most of the other scholars in maybe Tabrizi and everybody, they acknowledge to this. So,
but is anyone claiming verses have been inserted in?
No, not about
Taken
insertion,
out.
taken
Okay.
out. So,
but that's different, a little bit different. Now, whatever is the Quran is infallible. Now, if stuff has been taken out, that's another thing. But the Quran itself is infallible.
I don't think anyone rejects Quran.
No,
what it is now, it's their Veda. This is
So it's Shruti,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If something's been taken out, that's okay.
maybe because this dervish idea, that also was born out of it, because they say Dawood experiencing Bhagavan, maybe Allah Savajal through all the forces, through air he can see Bhagavan, through fire, water he can see Bhagavan. So the Sufis, the dervishes, they actually don't give so much importance on the scripture Quran rather than their practice of this dancing and everything.
Okay. That's interesting, but that's okay. That's another interesting point. But focusing on form, any questions?
There are some questions online.
Pardon? Online?
Some questions online, if it's fine.
Friends?
We have Tanvi.
We have. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to know back then when Christians were made fun of. Am I not feeling to you?
Can you understand anything?
Hello?
Yes.
Okay, I tried to hear you loud. Who was it that actually made fun of the Christians? Because I was wondering how this shift actually happened from them believing the form, and then who came that made fun of them?
Well, the best source, if you want to read, Celsus was a Greek philosopher, and we don't have his book left. But Origen, the great church father, he has a response to Celsus's critique of Christianity. So that's probably the best and earliest source. It's very extensive. So if you are interested in that, read Origen's response to Celsus, and Celsus is scathing in his utter contempt for the Christian beliefs. So that's probably the best place to get a sense of the 3rd century kind of Greek condescension to Christian beliefs. That you have this thing of God gets nailed, I mean, just ridiculing some of the foundational beliefs of Christianity. Celsus.
The philosophers themselves, they actually challenged that and thought that was enough to change the whole thought, let's say, the whole belief of the thought.
It's more like they I don't know how much they challenged it, but they just ridiculed it. And Origen was a Platonist. So these are the early church fathers. If you read their history, they were all Platonists or Aristotelians. In other words, they were, before they became Christians, who were they? They were intellectual, they were educated in Greek intellectuality, and then they became Christians. So they brought all those samskaras into Christianity with them. So they were kind of scholars that converted to Christianity. So they started off with a repertoire, their education already in place, and then they brought that into defending the truths of Christianity. So I think it was more like that. It's not like the Christians, scrambled to go and, okay, we better study Greek philosophy now. They were Greek-educated people. I'm talking about the theologians. Theologians means you're an intellectual. So those intellectuals why were they intellectuals? Because they were Greek-educated. So they brought all that in with them, I would think. Yeah, I'm sure there's all kinds of different cases, but that would be, I would think, a common one.
And then they probably had some higher positions in church.
Pardon?
They had some higher positions in church.
Yeah, they were the founding fathers. They were all bishops. For the most part, anyway. Origen was very powerful. Probably one of the most influential, eventually becomes considered a heretic, but he was probably one of the most influential thinkers before Augustine and Aquinas. Origen. And then there's Tertullian and others.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you get Augustine, and he speaks against God with the body. And then Aquinas, and then by the time that's it. They put all the final nails in the coffin. But they're also getting their arguments from Aristotle and Plato. I think Aquinas is more Aristotelian. I forget which one is which. Bhadra.
Yes, Prabhu, thank you so much for your class today. I have two questions. The first one is regarding you were saying that through intelligence. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, a little bit muffled, but yes.
Yeah. Okay. So that through intelligence you can establish Iśvara as omnipotent and omnipresent, but the only way to establish the form of God is through beauty. Right? So my question is that the argument can come that beauty is can be a subjective experience. So how to combat that? How to reject that?
I wasn't sure of your question. Through intelligence, we can establish that there must be an Iśvara, there must be an intelligent Iśvara. That intelligence has to be omni because it has to account for omni in the universe, and he has to be able to put it together so not only is he omniscient but omnipotent. Okay, that's intelligence. And then you're saying the beauty argument is also a rational argument? Yeah, but that's what we're constructing that. That's a new argument. Classically and traditionally, that wasn't part of the repertoire of theistic arguments. That's something we're contributing to the conversation. Ramanuja, the Vedantins would say, all you can do is establish an intelligent intelligence. And Nyaya would say, well, and plus he must know everything about the product, so therefore he's omniscient. And Vedanta says he must be omnipotent because he creates the universe. That's how he's different from a siddha. But the beauty argument is ours. I mean, it's inherent. It's not ours. It's there in the Bhagavatam, but it hasn't been formalized. It hasn't been formally constructed. So that's something that we can continue the conversation. Why not? We can continue the theistic conversation. But that's our dharma. Yeah.
Thank you. That was one question, and the other is saying a form of Jesus, baby Jesus, was stolen, and people were really like crazy, and a lot of news that baby Jesus was stolen. So they are still worshiping Jesus as form. So what is your explanation regarding this? That still now, at least in Catholic Church, they are still worshiping Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, you could make that's a good point. You could say that they lost the God of the Old Testament to Greek philosophy, right? The God of the Old Testament, the form and all of that gets decapitated by Greek philosophy, but it gets projected onto baby Jesus, is what you're saying. So that same inclination to adore form is now, you can't apply it to God anymore because of all the philosophical problems of the Greeks have pointed out. So it gets projected on baby Jesus. I think that's sort of what you're saying, yeah. But we can't go there with our book, because it's too vast. If you're going to get into Jesus, that's a huge, massive 2,000 years worth of theology. I'm not going to touch that with a barge pole. We have to stick to the God of the Old Testament. Otherwise, it becomes completely unworkable. But your point is good. I think your point is very good. It's kind of like, all of the gods. Up until the Enlightenment, the universe was enchanted, right? There were gods, there were spirits, there were angels, and we've sterilized that, but we kind of get it back with our sci-fi movies, with Avatar. Have you noticed how our movies, there's so many of these spacey movies, and maybe technology mixed in, the gods, they're making a comeback, because it's just nature, it's just human nature to live in an enchanted universe, but we sterilized it with our science, so we still we have to somehow channel that above, and so we do it through our movies. And all of these sci-fi movies it's the same kind of point. It's kind of like a substitute projection. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Do we want to go on? You don't have to sit politely. If you need to go, please. I did the other day. I got up and I left because I couldn't hear anything. But if you need to go, don't feel, you're very polite. And I offer my namaha, but, no, senza complimenti, as they say in Italy. Ananda Priya. Ananda Priya, do you have a question?
Yes. You hear me?
Barely. You could try, but I don't know why you're not coming out over here. But go ahead.
Yeah, it's very, for me also, it's very low. I have just first.
Can you hear that?
The comments first, the appreciation is very interesting, what you're discussing, very, very interesting. One thing also is around the time of Constantine, there was a big reform where also they removed.
Shall I tell her I don't? Anandapriya Ji, I'm terribly sorry, but I can't hear. Your words are muffled. I'm so sorry.
Sorry, we just did not manage to find the cables.
There's some cable problem here.
Okay, no problem, but I would be interested to meet you at some point and discuss if it's a problem in group. I could probably meet you, but I could bring maybe some interesting point to discuss with you.
Okay. We'll find another opportunity then. Thank you. Sorry, Anandapriya. Okay, it's Sri. If we have the same problem with you, then we'll come to an end. Sri. A little bit. If you speak loudly and a little bit slowly.
Okay, maybe right now is better?
Much better.
Right now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, yeah, I just want to tell you that your expositions get me inside. So, generally for me, it's very difficult to talk or ask questions when I have certain amount of feelings inside. So, thank you for opening up these topics. And what I want to ask you is, I'm here in Vrindavan. If you have some time for have certain exchange about certain evidences that I had after many years of study Judaism and certain specific sources that prove exactly the opposite, which is that the scriptures in this particular tradition, as well as in the Quran, as you mentioned, and also for the Sufi part, that God indeed have form, and this form is secret, and it has been revealed in certain specific cases. And the references come specifically from the Sefer HaZohar, Sefer Yetzirah, and other specific texts that are complementary to the Torah and to the Tanakh, and declarations straight in Aramaic, for example, in the case of Jesus Christ when he make the Father, the prayer for the Father. In some point he is telling Ani Shahua, and these have certain different meanings, but the main meaning is I am black. And this is quite interesting, as you say, when the Prophet Muhammad described this form of God as a young man that comes to him, which the Sufis also develop on that furthermore. So yeah, I would like just to exchange this like scriptural evidence of those situations where they specifically describe that, because I think it can nurture your work or the project that you are doing in a very interesting way. And it comes from rabbinical learnings and exchange also, and from some specific system and methodology, and how the alphanumeric language, which is the Hebrew, bring out certain secrets or reveal certain things in the scriptures that are completely different in how the Greek culture or the Roman culture like steps beyond. They change, they modify. So I am agreeing several points you made here about the Greek culture and all of these things, and I just wanted to point it out or invite you to receive maybe this scriptural evidence that can maybe compound the work that you are doing, and also be grateful with you for pointing out this topic. It's quite interesting, and in my particular case, I have been studying that for a long time, so it's very nice to hear about that from other sources.
Yes, Prabhu, thank you. Yeah, I'd be very happy to. I'd be, welcoming if you have additional scriptural sources. I assume they're not mainstream sources. They must be kind of cryptic sources or mystical sources. But whatever they are, I'd be very happy to encounter them. So yeah, please send an email, and we can be in touch about it. Is that okay?
Actually, Zoom is, our laptop has crashed, so it's restarting.
Pardon?
Unfortunately, our laptop has crashed, so he didn't hear the last point that you said, but because we have some technical issue here.
Okay, what do you want me to do?
We'll just
Repeat it.
We can call it a day, probably. For today.
Okay. I'm quite. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Right.
So thank you very much, Prabhuji, for this enlightening talk. And it's a lot of good points for those who want to believe that God has a form and want to have some dialogue. And we are waiting for your book very eagerly.
Yes.
Don't be too eager. It's gonna.
Less eager?
Pardon?
You can be less eager?
Kidding, yeah.
Okay. Jai Shri Ram.
Jai Shri Ram.